the Kremlin have completely fouled up their hand, right? Remember, they were supposed to get the advantage back in August, which is when Putin met Trump in Alaska. And Lavrov was so confident of this. He's the one, he showed up. And, he's usually in that suit and tie, right? Natalie dressed. He showed up in that sweatshirt with the USSR logo on it, right? Like, dude. Now, whether he took a bit of personal grief for overplaying his hand, the fact is that the Kremlin did not get an advantage out of that August summit. If anything, Zelensky and the Europeans were able to push back. And they, as I said, they got the restored intelligence sharing. They got the renewed American military supplies, and they had the possibility of the Tomahawks. So rather than saying that, Lavrov was pushed out at that point, I'd say, look, the Kremlin was on the back foot at that point. We weren't sure where Lavrov was. We weren't sure what Putin was up to. And as I say, the people who helped put the Kremlin back together, as it were, are guys who can't put the U.S. administration together, which is Steve Witkoff. Because the key question here is, are Witkoff and Kushner going to go there and tell Putin, look, you got a ceasefire? You got a ceasefire, then we'll discuss all of this. Or are they going to say, we need to talk how we push back against Ukraine and Europe again? What's our next move to get Donald Trump on board with you guys? Because behind Witkoff and Kushner, there's J.D. Vance. Now, J.D. is being quite quiet. He has been quite quiet, right? But when all this broke loose over the past couple of weeks, there were leaks from inside Washington and from Europeans that Vance is supporting the Witkoff-Kushner initiative. So he knows what's going down. There's also a second element, which is key here, Louis, which I need to add, which has come out in the last few days. Remember I talked about Dmitriev talking about those U.S.-Russian joint projects? That's serious stuff. That's really serious stuff. Let me explain why. Vladimir Putin, some of the people who are connected with him, the Russian oligarchs, as you were, the billionaires, Gennady Timchenko, Yuri Kovalchuk, the Rotenberg brothers, Boris and Arkady, they have sent representatives to U.S. companies while they are sanctioned. These guys are sanctioned. They've sent representatives to U.S. companies to talk about rare earth mining and energy deals. Okay. Those talks also include revival of those Nord Stream pipelines from Russia to Germany that were damaged in the sabotage operations in 2022. But there's more. ExxonMobil's senior vice president, a guy named Neil Chapman, has met the head of Russia's largest private energy company, Rosneft, which is headed up by Igor Sechin, who is very close to Vladimir Putin. He's Putin's former private secretary. And there's more. Gentry Beach, who is a college friend of Donald Trump Jr. and a major donor to Donald Trump Sr., is in talks to get a stake in a Russian Arctic gas project. And another Trump donor, Stephen Lynch, has paid $600,000 this year to a lobbyist trying to get a Treasury Department license to revive the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from a Russian state-owned company. There are all types of economic links that are there despite the U.S. sanctions. So you've got Kushner and Witkoff, both guys that are in it for economic deals, both guys who potentially could profit from those deals, and indeed Donald Trump could profit from those deals, who are in Moscow, backed by J.D. Vance, who wants to be president in 2028, and who is no fan of the European Union and no fan of the defense of Ukraine. That's the big barrier that we've got coming up tomorrow, in the sense of, do they undo everything we have had from Russia, from Ukraine and Europe to push back that ultimatum over the past week and a half?
And what is going on here then with the US approach? Because obviously on one hand, as you say, you've got Rubio working very closely with the Europeans, and then we've got Witkoff and Jared Kushner seemingly off in a completely different direction and being accused of working more closely with the Russians than they probably should be. Shouldn't there be an overall leadership here from the US president? It almost feels like they're putting a bit of blood in the water and letting the sharks fight it out.
You know the answer to this one, Louis. You can't get leadership from a guy who knows naff all about what is happening with Ukraine and Russia, besides some general idea that there's a lot of money to be made out of the project. So Trump just keeps spinning like a weather vane, depending on whether he thinks he can get more personal glory and a bit more profit from the Russian side or from the Ukrainian side. And we had this picture yesterday, this entirely dysfunctional U.S. administration, where although Rubio was leading the delegation in Florida, the meeting was being held at Steve Witkoff's private club, right? And next to Rubio is Witkoff and Kushner. And there's a photograph, and it's interesting. The Ukrainians put it out, right? So it's like one of those official press snaps that you get. And if you look at the photograph, it's not too flattering at the Americans. Rubio looks like he's a bit dazed, right? But the Ukrainian delegation are just staring daggers at Witkoff, absolutely staring. Why is this guy even at this table? Now, they've got to accept he's at that table. They've got to, the fact here is Trump is invested in this guy. He's been his friend since the 1980s, and he thinks Witkoff can bring him more glory and more money. Because I've got to add one other thing here. The fact why Kushner is back in part is because Kushner and Witkoff got a lot of capital off of the so-called arrangement to end Israel's mass killing in Gaza at the start of October. Now, that deal is shaky at best and could go pear-shaped. But for the moment, it's like Kushner and Witkoff went in, they talked to the Israelis, they, along with the Arab states, talked to Hamas's representatives, and then they got an end to 2 years of mass killing for now. So now they come back as the boys who did this. So now, I guess they can do the same thing with Ukraine and Russia. It's just, the thing here is that nobody does a due diligence check on who Witkoff's talking to. And I don't think Steve Witkoff went to Donald Trump and said, I'm going to talk to Vladimir Putin's top foreign policy guy, Yuri Yushakov. I think he probably talked to Kushner, he talked to someone else and said, all right, let's talk to Yushakov, see what we can do. Straight up, I'm going to tell you this, that at this point, the more functional arrangement, it's not one we like, the more functional arrangement is between Vladimir Putin's guys working with Witkoff and Kushner, right? That's what we're working with. And then on the other side, if you have what passes for a functional arrangement, it's Marco Rubio, his guys out of State Department, who are working with officials whose names you will never know because they're more at the working level within the military, within state, and within intelligence agencies who don't like this. They don't like the way it stinks. Should I add one other thing as well? There's a name that's missing here because he has effectively either been pushed out or just threw up his hands and said, I'm not sticking around. And that's Keith Kellogg, who is the longtime Trump envoy to Ukraine. Kellogg had sort of receded from public view last month. And then as Witkoff and Kushner are scheming, the only time he pops up is to do a Fox News interview. And then at the same time, it's announced he's out of here in January. Officially, he's resigning from the White House. But, you pay your money, take your choice on whether he resigned, whether he was forced out, or whether he just thought, Christ, I got better things to do with my life than stick around these head cases.
And we talk about some of the internals of Washington and the White House there. There seems to be some sort of shifting about going on in the Kremlin as well. Do you think we're likely to see Lavrov coming up again in any of these talks that we're expecting to see? And what does it mean if he isn't involved?
No, I think Lavrov is back. I think the simplest explanation is the one Mark Galeotti, with whom you work on Frontline, put out, is that Lavrov is in his 70s and he could well have been ill, and it may not have been a diplomatic illness. I think there was a bit of tension because around that mid-October period, before Witkoff talks to Ushakov in the Kremlin, the Kremlin have completely fouled up their hand. Right? Remember, they were supposed to get the advantage back in August, which is when Putin met Trump in Alaska. And Lavrov was so confident of this. He's the one, he showed up. And, he's usually in that suit and tie, right? Natalie dressed. He showed up in that sweatshirt with the USSR logo on it, right? Like, dude. Now, whether he took a bit of personal grief for overplaying his hand, the fact is that the Kremlin did not get an advantage out of that August summit. If anything, Zelensky and the Europeans were able to push back. And they, as I said, they got the restored intelligence sharing. They got the renewed American military supplies, and they had the possibility of the Tomahawks. So rather than saying that, Lavrov was pushed out at that point, I'd say, look, the Kremlin was on the back foot at that point. We weren't sure where Lavrov was. We weren't sure what Putin was up to. And as I say, the people who helped put the Kremlin back together, as it were, are guys who can't put the U.S. administration together, which is Steve Witkoff. Bless his heart. I've spoken to y'all for months about Steve Witkoff, and I've had fun with him, as the purported envoy and the real estate developer. And he's found his role. He's completely ineffective within the U.S. administration. He has no diplomatic experience. He has no experience on Ukraine and Russia, but he's really, really effective working as a Kremlin official. Really effective. So kudos to Steve for finding his place.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.